Good afternoon. My name is John Reed McDonald, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Field Operations for PrideStaff and PrideStaff Financial. On behalf of all four of our staffing brands, as I said, PrideStaff and PrideStaff Financial, RX Relief, and Insurance Relief, it is our pleasure to introduce Mark Murphy of Leadership IQ for an informative, timely, and practical learning session applicable to leaders in any organization or industry. You may already know Mark's work or heard him speak, but in case you haven't, Mark Murphy is the founder and CEO of Leadership IQ, a top-rated research and consulting firm that delivers employee engagement and leadership development to the world's most successful organizations and their leaders. An expert in aligning goals and people to create healthy organizational change, Mark leads one of the world's largest leadership and goal-setting studies. His work has appeared in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, Forbes, Bloomberg Businessweek, U.S. News and World Report, and the Washington Post, and Mark has been a featured guest on programs including CBS News Sunday Morning, ABC's 2020, Fox Business News, and NPR. And backed by rigorous research, Mark's best-selling books offer leaders clear and actionable solutions. His most recent book, Hiring for Attitude, was featured in Fast Company, the Wall Street Journal, and was chosen as a top business book by CNBC. Some of his other titles that you may know include The 100 Percenters, Challenge Your People to Give It Their All, and They'll Give You Even More. And he also wrote Hard Goals, the science of getting from where you are to where you want to be. Today, Mark is going to share with us practical ways to improve and foster communication throughout your organization and allow all of us to learn to speak the truth to each other in a productive way that will even allow us to tackle taboo subjects and maybe even some of those sacred cows that we all have within our organization. So without further delay, Mark, what do you say we get started?
Awesome. Thanks so much, John Reed, and it's great to be here with everybody. And this is always a fun topic to talk about, right? We're talking about speaking the truth. Now, we don't need to have programs on how to say really awesome, super nice things to people. Usually we can just call somebody up and go, hey, wow, you look awesome today, and that's easy enough to do. When we're talking about speaking the truth, we're usually talking about deeper, touchier, more sensitive kinds of topics. And depending on who we're talking to, we're going to have to adjust our message accordingly to make sure that ultimately everything we want this person to hear actually gets through. Now, here's the problem. Here's the basic challenge with this. Because these conversations are usually difficult, a lot of people, and by a lot, I mean 80+% of people, generally avoid or have avoided having these kinds of conversations. So 80+% of managers in our studies say they've avoided giving feedback because they were afraid that the employee they were going to give it to was going to have a bad reaction. Basically, they said, I don't want to give this feedback because somebody's head is going to explode. Ironically, though, this is stuff we generally do need to talk about, because when we ask employees, do you get enough feedback? You know, does your boss tell you everything you need to know? Do your colleagues tell you everything you need to know? If you make a mistake, do you want to hear about it? 51% of employees say they don't get nearly enough constructive feedback. They don't get nearly enough speaking of truth to them. And they want the information because they know that this is going to tell them what they need to do to improve and be better. Everybody wants to be successful. So we've got an issue. People avoid the topic, but we need to actually have these conversations with each other. So what we're going to talk about today are really three kinds of conversations to have. How do we speak the truth to people? Depends very much on who it is we're speaking to. Now, there are three kinds of conversations. There's the typical one, which is going to cover the bulk of what it is we need to discuss. And this, we're going to use a script called the ideal script. And it's a way of reducing defensiveness, of opening people up to the possibility of hearing what it is we have to say, opening them up to the possibility of hearing the truth that we're going to speak to them. And this will encompass a good 70-80% of the situations where we're going to have to speak the truth. So this is going to be our foundational program. But there are two other kinds of situations. There's a situation where we're talking to somebody that is just so attuned, so self-aware. They're they're criticizing themselves before we ever even think of going and giving them feedback. And we're going to talk through a very simple script to give feedback to somebody like that. How do you speak the truth to somebody that is so open, so receptive that we don't want our conversation to be overkill? Then, on the flip side of things, we're going to talk through how do you give feedback? How do you speak the truth to somebody that is, well, by trying to think of a nice way to put this, a pain. They're not terribly self-aware. They're aggressive. They're not open to any kind of feedback, let alone coming from us. How do we give them some feedback? How do we have a tough conversation with them? So we're going to use these three conversations as basically the pillars for what we're going to talk about today. Now, before we do that, though, I want to just give you a very quick little quiz. And this is a little quiz. I'm not going to ask for your scores or anything like that. This is for you. And what it is a simple little 4-question about how people react when you give them feedback. So let's just quickly walk through this. There are 4 questions. It's very simple. And they're asked on a 1 to 7 scale, 1 being never, 7 being always. Question 1, when people receive tough feedback from me, they offer excuses. Like, I couldn't get it done because the internet was running slow last night. I couldn't get that assignment done because the server crashed. Question 2, when people receive tough feedback from me, they shift the blame to others. Like, it's not my issue because, Bob's the one who's responsible for that report. He's the one who messed it all up. And again, this is on a 1 to 7 scale. 1, this never happens to me. 7, this always happens to me, or anything in between. Question 3, when people receive tough feedback from me, they become aggressive. Like, I don't know who you think you're criticizing, but I'm the best person this department has. I don't know why you think you can come talk to me like this. I'm the best person you've ever seen. And then question 4, when people receive tough feedback from me, they shut down and sit there silent and disengaged. Okay, very simple. 4 questions. You take this for yourself, and this is just sort of a little personal, honest gut check moment for each of us. Say, how often do I get these kinds of reactions? We may get all of them. We may get just one of them. But depending on where it is, this is going to help us kind of pinpoint some of the things that we need to be working on. Now, if you get a high score on this, this is sort of like golf, and that high score is not so good. So when we find that we're in that 20 to 28, if we total up our score on those 4 questions, it's going to range anywhere between 4 to 28 points. If we're in that 20 to 28 range, it's basically for poor feedback. We're setting people up. We're probably using some loaded language. We're coming with too aggressive a stance. We're doing something that is not positioning us for success. 9 to 19, we're kind of so-so. And then if we can hit that 4 to 8 place, that's where our feedback is going to get really exceptional. Now, there is one quick thing I need to point out with regard to this quiz. You'll notice that every one of these questions is framed when people receive tough feedback from me. When people receive feedback. Notice these aren't questions about when I give feedback, I do X. They're questions about when the people to whom I'm giving feedback get the feedback, they do X. This is a hugely important distinction because feedback is less about the words that come out of your mouth and more about the words that go into their ears. That is the essence of what feedback is about. It's about getting your message heard. So you can wax philosophic, you can speak eloquently, you can be loquacious, you can be silent. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the person on the receiving end of your feedback receives it in the right way, and that is the essence. So, when we look at feedback, it's less about, well, I said it, I gave them the feedback, and I gave darn good feedback, so I'm in the right. It doesn't matter. If they didn't hear the feedback, we don't get style points for speaking beautifully. We only get points if the person to whom we're trying to give the feedback actually says, wow, I got that feedback and that was important. This is one of the most fundamental insights with giving feedback, with speaking the truth, is that it's not about your mouth. It's about their ears. And if you remember that, everything else just becomes a very simple tactical thing to do. Now, before we get into the conversations we should have, let me spend just a minute on conversations you ought not to have. When it comes to speaking the truth to people, we're going to want our message to be pretty clean. We're going to want it to be devoid of a lot of emotion and anger, certainly, all this kind of stuff. We're going to want our message stripped down fairly simply. And we want to avoid trying to put in place a whole bunch of machinations that distort our message. So 6 big conversations we want to avoid having when we're trying to speak the truth to somebody. Conversation number 1, we want to avoid attacking. Attacking is very simply, you know, you're a jerk. I don't know how you think you can get away with this, little mister, but you've done this 4 times now, and it is irritating me more and more every single time you do it. Okay, that sounds like something we might do if our kid came in after curfew and we were woken up from a deep sleep and uncorking on them. But it does not generally work. It doesn't work with a kid, but it certainly doesn't work when we're having an adult-to-adult conversation. Pleading also does not work. Come on, please, if you just, cut me some slack on this one. If you could just possibly show up to work on time, like, I don't know, just try for like 2 days next week. That would just be, come on, please. Pleading doesn't work because it distorts the power dynamic and puts us in a submissive position, and it just messes things up exceptionally. And we may as well say to the person, you've now got total control of this relationship. Manipulate me as you see fit. We also, though, don't want to have the third conversation disintegrating. Disintegrating basically means I'm going to put all of my issues onto you. Well, listen, I know you think that I'm giving you some tough feedback, but you don't even understand that I'm getting tough feedback 20 times a day. The CEO is coming to me all the time. You don't even understand how hard this is on me. Listen, giving feedback, speaking the truth is not time for a therapy session for us. It is a time for us to deliver a message to another person, but it's not time for us to use this to vent on all the frustration that we're feeling. The 5th conversation, I'm going to skip the 4th for a second, we don't want to have is the soft pedaling. Well, listen, I guess you were only late, 16 times last month. It could have been 18, right? So it's really not that bad. Downplaying an issue that is serious just because we don't want to have that serious conversation, that's bad. And then the 2 worst conversations that we really want to avoid are shirking and compliment sandwiches. Shirking basically means I'm going to take whatever it is I have to say to you and ascribe it to somebody else. So listen, Bob, I think you're doing a great job. But you know that new vice president we got, you know what her problem is. Man, she seems to have it out for you. Were up to me, I'd give you a 5 out of 5 in your next performance review. I think you're awesome. She seems to have a problem with you, but, that's how it is. Where we take our issue, we ascribe it to somebody else, and we basically throw them under the bus. Not only does this not get our feedback message through, but it actually destroys the whole relationship, the whole pyramid of relationships. And then there's the compliment sandwich. And the compliment sandwich is basically when we say, we give a compliment, sneak in some constructive feedback, and then give another compliment. So it would sound like, listen, Bob, you're just so smart. You're so talented. You're probably the brightest person on the team. You're kind of a cantankerous jerk when we're in our team meetings, and, your colleagues are really getting upset with the way you talk to them. But you're just so smart and so talented that, I just want everybody to see all this wicked brain power you've got going on upstairs. And unfortunately, when you deliver feedback like that, what Bob tends to hear is, I'm great, I'm wonderful. I'm great, I'm wonderful. I hear a compliment, then Charlie Brown's teacher, and then I hear a compliment. Now, again, the measure of how well you give feedback is to what extent do the people you're giving feedback to hear the feedback and then take action to actually change their behavior. If they're not changing, we're not giving great feedback. If they're not hearing it, we're not giving great feedback. And so what happens is people will say, well, I like the compliment sandwich because I get to give the feedback and the person's head doesn't explode. Well, of course their head doesn't explode. It's because they didn't actually hear the message we were trying to deliver. If the one message is you're being a jerk to your teammates and you're cantankerous and you're sarcastic and they feel intimidated and it's destroying morale, that's the fundamental issue we've got to grapple with. It's not, you're smart, you're talented. That's a separate message. The issue we've got to deal with is we've got to speak the truth to this person so that they actually change their behavior, and that's the fundamental issue we've got to grapple with. Now, those are the conversations we don't want to have. One simple model to keep in your head, remember I mentioned that We want to kind of strip down our communication. If you want to give really great feedback using the 3 scripts we're going to get to in just a minute here, you want to make sure that you've taken all of the junk out of your message, all of the stuff that will get in your way, all of the interpretation, the emotions, all of that stuff. We got to strip that away so we can get to the essence of the feedback we need to deliver, speaking the truth. So as we go through these 3 various scripts, you're going to notice that they are all following a protocol of fact-based communication. Now, what's that mean? Think of every conversation as basically having 4 levels. They're facts, interpretations, reactions, and ends. So every conversation begins with some facts. And let's just take something simple, not even a conversation. Let's say I hear a rustling in the bushes. Let's say I'm walking outside and I hear a rustling in the bushes, like, there's something in the bushes. Okay, that's a fact. The fact is that something made noise in the bush. Okay, so I don't know bushes, but imagine there's just some big green leafy thing, and it starts to move, and it's rustling. Okay, that's a fact. Now, the human brain is not really a fact engine. The human brain is an interpretation engine. So we look at that rustling in the bushes, and the natural human reaction is to give that meaning. So if I'm a bird watcher, I may look at that rustling in the bushes and say, oh my gosh, I think that's a yellow-bellied redbeaker. And boy, I'm really excited. I've never seen one of those before. And so I'm going to have an interpretation. My interpretation is, boy, that's a good thing. It's a red-bellied, yellow-headed beak bobber or whatever. And so that's cool. That's cool. If I've just spent 3 nights in a row staying up late watching horror movies, then I might look at that rustling in the bushes and my interpretation is, oh my gosh, I'll bet you there's a headless clown that is in those bushes and it's going to come eat me. So I'm going to make an interpretation based on my life experience, based on my experience with bushes, based on my natural predilections. Am I afraid, not afraid, whatever. I'm going to interpret that rustling in the bushes in a particular way. Now, once I've made my interpretation, I then have an emotional reaction. If I think there's a red-beaked, yellow-bellied head bopper in there, that's a good bird that I've never seen, I'm going to have an emotional reaction that is excited. If I think there's a headless clown from the dead that wants to eat me, then probably my emotional reaction is going to be scared and totally freaked out. And then once we have that emotional reaction, we have some desired end. And the desired end is if there's a red-yellowed head bopper in there, then I'm going to say, wow, I got to get my binoculars and go find it. If I think it's a headless clown, then my desired end is probably going to be to run away screaming. So this is kind of how the human brain processes the world around us. Now, why am I mentioning all of this in communication? The reason I'm mentioning all of this is that facts are, when we're giving feedback, facts are a good thing to talk about. Interpretations, reactions, and ends are generally bad things to talk about. Facts are very simple. They're candid, they're verifiable, they're objective, they're specific, they're unemotional. They just are what they are. They have all sorts of wonderful attributes that make them fairly easy to talk about. If we have an employee, for example, that is 5 minutes late to work one day, that's a fact. The 5 minutes late punching in is a fact. If our interpretation is that they're lazy jerks who don't care about the team, that's our interpretation, that's going to cause us to have an emotional reaction, which is probably going to be angry or irritated. And as a desired end, we may then turn around and say, I want you to text me every single morning before you leave from home so I can make sure that you get to work on time. We've just gone from an employee being 5 minutes late to crazy town, basically in the span of about a millisecond. Because what if it turns out that the employee was 5 minutes late because they were talking to our new chairperson of the board out in the parking lot. And the chairperson of the board was asking them, oh, how's your manager doing? And they were singing our praises to the chairperson of the board. Well, now all of a sudden, our interpretation is completely wrong. And if we go into a conversation with a wrong interpretation, not ever will this person who we're giving feedback to trust us again. So when we have conversations, we really want to strip out the interpretations, reactions, and ends, and really focus ourselves on the facts. This is an actual example of a boss giving feedback to an employee. The boss, the employee, VP of Marketing, had been working on a memo for a new product launch, and the CEO, the boss, had found 2 typos in this memo. So the boss says to Sally, the VP of Marketing, he says to her, Sally, I asked you to work on the tone of this yesterday, did I not? And look at this. I caught 2 typos. Look, I count on you to get these things right. I don't have time to worry about them myself. And it's like everything I said yesterday was just ignored, which really makes me wonder what else it is you're missing. Not to mention, I'm getting pretty irritated by all of this. You know what? For the next 2 months, even for small things, I want to proofread everything before you send it out. Now, this, sadly, is not uncommon. Messages like this get given all the time. But look at this. It's an entire paragraph of stuff. And yet, where are the facts? Well, let's just give the CEO the benefit of the doubt and say that the 2 typos he identified were, in fact, typos. So he looks and he says there's 2 typos. Okay, that's the fact. What's all the rest of this, though? How do you fill an entire paragraph with 2 typos? Oh, you don't. You fill a paragraph with interpretations, reactions, and ends. So the boss says there are 2 typos. That's the fact. But then what does he say? It's like everything I said yesterday was just ignored. Well, that's an interpretation. So the interpretation is that Sally has ignored everything he says. It's that interpretation. The typos aren't irritating him. It's the fact that it's not the fact, it's the interpretation that he thinks that she has ignored everything else he said that sparks the emotional reaction, which is, I'm getting pretty irritated by all of this. And then as a result of his irritation, his desired end is that he wants to proofread, even if she's sending out an invite to, pizza in the lunchroom, he wants to make sure that he gets to proofread everything she sends out for the next 2 months. So see how we've gone from 2 typos to absolute insanity, and we've done it immediately. We've done it incredibly quickly. The other kicker about this is if your goal is to yell at Sally, well, then have at it. You've accomplished that. But if the goal is to help Sally not have any more typos in her memos, well, Sally's not going to listen to a thing we say because she's going to be so defensive, so on edge, that she's not going to hear anything and be able to work with us on the typos. If we went to her and said, Sally, do you have a few minutes to talk? I'd like to talk to you about the 2 typos in that memo. Well, now we could actually have a conversation with Sally about the typos. Where did they come from? Does she have too many things on her plate? Did she not proofread it? What can she do moving forward to make sure that she doesn't have more typos? Now we could actually have a constructive conversation, but we're not going to have a constructive conversation when we're talking about interpretations, reactions, and ends. We need to focus on facts and let the conversation go from there. I will say, too, in a lot of the Leadership IQ research, we have identified that bad conversations use a lot of loaded language, a lot of interpretive language. They say you a lot more, like you need to do this. You're not getting your work done. They contain a lot of adverbs. Well, you're not getting things done quickly enough. You're not getting it done smartly enough. It's very bad what it is you're doing. It's a lot of amped up, a lot of fuzzy language. And again, that's very loaded language, and it tends to set people off. Factual language is not quickly. Factual language is it was 3 minutes and 30 seconds late. It was really, really tardy is not factual language. I don't know what really, really means. Negative emotions. Again, this is bad stuff to include in constructive feedback conversations and speaking the truth. Anything that has the risk of setting people off. Angry, I'm aggravated, I'm afraid, I'm pessimistic, I'm unhappy with your performance. All of this stuff is emotional reaction. It's not fact-based. And then, of course, negation words are always destined to set people off. Almost always, virtually, to set people off. No, can't, couldn't, didn't, and of course, the absolutes themselves. Always, never, absolutely, unquestionably. All of this stuff is very loaded language. It all says, I'm not speaking factually. I am speaking with hyperbole. I'm giving you interpretations, reactions, and ends. And when we do that, we're basically in for a very difficult conversation. So now that we've got some research, we've got a mindset, we're going to go fact-based communication. We're going to focus on making that the person on the receiving end of our message actually hears what we have to say. let's talk about these three models. The ideal script is the foundational one. This is the one you're going to use at least 80% of the time. And this is the one that we're going to spend the most time on, because if you get this one, then the other two scripts, the COM script is for really difficult people. The constructive dialogue script, the CD script, that's for amazingly high-performing, emotionally intelligent people. The ideal script, if we get that foundation, these other two ones, COM and the constructive dialogue, are just so simple. It'll take you 30 seconds to learn them. So let's begin with the ideal script. The point of this is not to script every word you're going to say, but rather to show you how to disarm somebody and open up the possibility of having a conversation. Listen, you don't need to attend a webinar to figure out how to yell at people. Have your kids irritate you enough? Yelling comes fairly naturally. I don't need any special course to figure out how to get irritated with my children. But we don't need to talk about that. What we do need to talk about, though, is why yelling doesn't work. If we yell at somebody, well, their walls of defensiveness are going to get up. They're not going to listen to a darn thing we say. So yelling doesn't work. What we've got to do is open up a dialogue such that this person actually wants to talk to us, actually wants to hear what we have to say, and then actually contributes to this conversation and takes ownership. I don't want children working for me. I want adults working for me, adults who can partner with me and become self-correcting and self-accountable. If I have to babysit everybody around me 24/7, I'm going to have a very miserable existence as a leader. So think of this as less of a script and more of a conversational structure. It's a way of disarming the person, opening up the possibility that they will want to have an actual dialogue with us. And if we get that, now we're in great shape. There are 6 parts to this. I know that sounds like a lot. It's really not going to take you but 20 seconds. I can do this in about 20 seconds just in conversational, and so will you. I'm only breaking this out into 6 parts just so you can see the logic of this and so you understand the psychology behind this. So 6 parts. Step 1 is we're going to invite them to partner. So let's just jump right into it. Step 1, I'm going to invite them to partner. That means that I'm going to begin by asking them, would you be willing to have a conversation with me about that memo you wrote last week? That's it. Simple. I told you this is very, very easy stuff once you figure out the various pieces. Would you be willing to have a conversation with me about that memo you wrote last week? Not, would you be willing to have a conversation with me about why you're such an inattentive jerk who ignores everything I say? That's not generally going to work. Would you be willing to have a conversation with me about that memo you wrote last week? What this does is it turns it from I'm a parent yelling at a student to I am an adult who's asking you to partner with me in a conversation. Because psychologically what happens is when they say yes, which they almost always will, when they say yes, they've now agreed to have a dialogue with you. It flips a switch in their brain that makes this a much more open conversation. By the way, some people will say, well, what happens if they say no? That's when you're going to use the COM script, and we'll get to them in just a minute. Every so often, well, no, I'm not having a conversation with you. I hate you. You're a jerk. Fine. Okay, we have another conversation for them. We'll set them aside. But for the moment, just presume that the person says yes, which most normal human beings will. Okay, would you be willing to have a conversation with me about whatever, that memo you wrote last week? Step 2, disarm yourself. I'd just like to review the situation to make sure I'm on the same page as you. Now, notice that I didn't say, I want to make sure we're on the same page. The reason I didn't say that is that when I say I want to make sure we're on the same page, that is never said in a truly collaborative sense. I want to make sure that we're on the same page here really means I want to make sure that you, idiot, are on my page. And it is so loaded, and it's such a cliched expression that we just can't use it. So what we're saying is I want to review the situation to make sure I'm on the same page as you. It doesn't mean I'm going to agree with you. It just means I want to understand where you're coming from. And step 3, if we have different perspectives, we can discuss those and develop a plan for moving forward. There's no fight coming. Whatever. We can have different perspectives. It's all cool. We're just having a conversation. And then step 4, does that sound okay? Now, kind of like the first step, we ask this again because we want to make sure that this person now, knowing a little bit more about what it is we want to talk about, is still on board with having this conversation. Because if they're not on board with having a conversation, what's the point of having the conversation, right? We want to make sure that they are on board with having this conversation. So this is another psychological check-in. Now, what have we done? We've been through 4 of the 6 steps, and all we've said is, hey, Pat, would you be willing to have a conversation with me about that memo you wrote last week? I just want to review the situation, make sure I'm on the same page as you, and you know what, if we have different perspectives, that's cool. We'll just sit down, talk about them, and figure out a plan for moving forward. Does that sound okay? What did that take? 8 seconds? 10 seconds? It's a very short thing, but it is so psychologically rich that rather than coming to the person and saying, we need to talk about that memo you wrote last week, that signals, I'm a parent, you're a child, sit back, turn off your ears, and get ready to get yelled at. This is going to take a while. What I've done is said, I want to have a conversation because you are an honest-to-goodness adult with intelligence and insight, and I want to have a conversation, a dialogue with you. I don't want to yell at you. I want to have a dialogue with you. The beautiful part about this, by the way, is you can use this with somebody who is subordinate to you on an org chart, somebody who is equal to you on an org chart, somebody who is superior to you on an org chart. This allows you to accommodate various power differentials. See, if you go yell at somebody, you can really only yell at people that are subordinate to you. It doesn't work there, but that's the only person you could get away with doing it and not get fired. Colleagues, very dangerous, and boss, you may as well come in with your resume prepared because that's about how it's going to end up. So this, though, when you have it as a conversation, you can do this with anybody at any level. Now, those are the first 4 steps. The 5th step, then, is to just simply list whatever the corrective feedback is. So we might say, okay, would you be willing to have a conversation with me about the memo you wrote last week? I just want to review the situation, make sure I'm on the same page as you. And if we have different perspectives, we can discuss those and develop a plan for moving forward. Does that sound okay? Yes, sounds okay. Okay, great. Now, in that memo from last week, I noticed that there were 2 typos. Now, I've just listed some feedback facts. I've just listed some facts. There were 2 typos. Now, I don't have to list a lot more than that. I'm going to list that there were 2 typos. And what I'm going to do now is assess how this person reacts to those facts. So, if the person says, oh my gosh, oh, I am so stupid. You know, I was in a rush and I've been getting a little sloppy lately and I forgot to proof it and I thought I could get away without having our proofreader proof it and I've made a mistake and, okay, what they've just signaled to you is that they've made a corrective leap. That means that they have absorbed the fact instantly, in this case, that they made a mistake. You don't need to spend the next 20 minutes beating them up about, well, you know there's 2 typos, right? And you should never have typos. Yeah, no, I get that. And you know that you cannot needs to be, you know, you can't just contract that with can't, and it needs to be cannot, but you used the wrong there instead of there, and yeah, no, I took 9th grade English. I get this. And now we beat them to death with feedback and feedback and feedback. They've already gotten it. They've already made the leap. They're already feeling terrible. They want to move on to how do I improve this. They don't need 20 minutes on here's all the things I did wrong. It becomes overkill. So what we want to do is give a little bit of feedback and test whether or not they've made that corrective leap. If they've made the corrective leap, just move on to the next step of this conversation. Now, if they haven't, what if you say there were 2 typos in the memo? Oh, well, I have no idea what you're talking about. Oh, well, okay, let me point them out to you. The typo was here, and then the typo was here. Oh, well, I disagree that that was a typo. I think that it's there, it should be T-H-E-I-R. Well, no, we just said that they are going to the conference, and, well, no, I think that's T-H-E-I-R. Okay, well, now they're wrong and they haven't made the corrective leap because they're still fighting with us about whether or not this was in fact a typo. So now we have to give a little more feedback. Well, okay, I can understand that that's what you were thinking. From your perspective, it wasn't in fact a typo. This is now a different issue. This is a grammar issue. Okay, let's pull out our Strunk and White, and let's go through and look at the rules of grammar and talk about what a contraction means versus a possessive third-person pronoun, blah, 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 and we can have that conversation. Okay, now we're still going to have this conversation until the point where they look at it and they go, oh, I get it, that was a mistake, yep. And once they've made that corrective leap, now we're basically able to move on. But this is kind of the lesson here, is you want to give as much feedback as you need to give to turn the light bulb on, but not much more than that. Because if we beat this thing to death, then this person is ready to make change, but we're still stuck on a backwards-looking beating them up to make sure they understand and feel terrible about it. That's not the point of feedback. The point of feedback is to help them understand what it is they did wrong, only enough so that we can now help them move forward. And moving forward basically means, tell me how you think we can work together to build on this and make things even more effective for the next time. That's it. So what we've really done is a very simple conversation. Would you be willing to have a conversation with me about that memo that you wrote last week? I'd just like to review the situation, make sure I'm on the same page as you. And if we have different perspectives, we can discuss those and figure out a plan for moving forward. Does that sound okay? Awesome. Great. So I was reading through this memo, and I found 2 typos in the memo. Do you know which ones I'm talking about? No, I have absolutely no idea. Oh, okay. Well, let me pinpoint them for you. I found one here, and I found one here. Oh my, geez, I did not even notice it. You know, as I was looking at it, I knew I should have sent it to the proofreader, but I was in such a rush, and you know, I just skipped that step this time. All right, well, fair enough, but let's spend a few minutes. Let's talk about how we can work on this and make things even better the next time. How do we avoid things like this in the future? How do we improve this so that the next time we don't have these? Now, what I've done is, instead of having a 20-minute conversation on why you're an idiot and messed up, I'm now having a 20-minute conversation on how can we work together to improve in the future. It's the difference between a backward-looking conversation and a forward-looking conversation. Listen, the typos are out. I can't fix the past, but I can fix the future. And so I don't really want to spend 20 minutes talking about something I can't fix. I'd much rather spend the next 20 minutes talking about how do we change the future. And that's the difference between a yelling at somebody and giving them coaching. We've now moved into a coaching model where we're just simply talking about how do we move forward in the future. The net effect is going to be better, because if we yell at them about the past, they're just going to get defensive and tune us out anyways. But if we become a constructive partner with them, now we can have a real conversation about how do we change the future. Now, you can skip the bulk of this if you're dealing with somebody who comes to you with tremendous levels of self-awareness. They come in with high levels of self-awareness. Now, you can skip some of the ideal script parts. So you can walk into this person and say, basically, you could skip right to the end and say, listen, you got a minute? I noticed there were 2 typos on the memo. How do we make sure that there aren't typos on the memo going forward? For somebody that has high levels of self-awareness, they've already figured out that there were typos on the memo. In fact, they may be bringing it to you. They may come into your office and say, oh my gosh, I am such an idiot. It's just, I'm so stupid. You should just fire me right on the spot. I typos. And okay, listen, you can sit here and cry in my office if you want to, I guess, but I have stuff I got to do, and this isn't really going to be all that helpful. So why don't we just take the next 5 minutes and let's talk about what we can do to make sure you don't have typos in the future. That's really the only relevant thing that's important. It's the only thing that's going to change the course of future events, which is the only thing I care about. So you could walk in and you could say, so listen, you know, you were in that meeting last week. Well, what went really well in that meeting last week? Oh, great relationship. We got a new price. We were able to increase the amount of business we're going to do with XYZ. Great. If there were any parts you could go back and do differently, what would you do differently? Oh, well, you know, I think I pushed a little hard. I may have gotten a little bit brusque during the conversation, and I think I could have softened that. Okay, well, great. Well, listen, why don't we talk for a minute? What do you think you could do in the future? How can I help? How can we work on this and sort of avoid that? I mean, yeah, you got some good results, but how do we avoid any of these difficulties in the future? The constructive dialogue, people, once you understand the basic logic of the ideal script, doing this with people who have really high levels of self-awareness is a piece of cake because you just get to skip a little bit. You don't have to go through this piece by piece by piece by piece always, as long as you remember the core foundation, which is this is about partnering, number one, and number two, it's about moving the conversation to a forward-looking conversation. Now, what about the opposite of this? Well, the opposite of this is a little bit more difficult. The conversation is simple. It is different than the ideal script. This is not the same. This script, this conversation is reserved for people that when you ask them, would you be willing to have a conversation with me about XYZ? They say, no, you can go take your conversation and stuff it because I'm not talking to you about this. All right, that's for whom this conversation is reserved. This is not a daily conversation. If you are having to have this daily, then you've got a fundamental problem with the people on the team. This should be a once-in-a-while script, not an everyday kind of script. So how do we do this? Well, the CALM script basically just stands for coolly state the facts, avoid blame, look for roadblocks, and manage expectations. Very simple. Okay. Coolly state the facts. Bob, I've gotten some reports of 3 comments you made last week about 5 of my employees. The comments were negative, including blah, 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 blah. You came into basically, Bob came into your department, started yelling at some of your employees. This violates your company's code of conduct. It's a not cool thing to do. And so you say to Bob, Bob, I've gotten reports of 3 comments made last week about 5 of my employees. The comments were negative, including, Frank, I think you're an idiot and messed up everything. Now, step 2, avoid blame. History is unimportant. I really don't care. But going forward, there won't be any more comments like these. So again, what are we doing? We're basically saying I'm not going to spend the next 20 minutes debating what you said and how it got interpreted and all that. I am telling you that going forward, we are not having this conversation anymore. So you can tell me whatever you want. I'm not here to rehash the history. I am, however, here to tell you what will and will not happen going forward. Now, is there anything that might prevent you and I from moving forward productively? That's looking for roadblocks. And then managing expectations is simply, I appreciate you taking time to talk and your assistance with this issue. Now, some people look at this and they go, oh my gosh, this is so cold. And it is. It's a very cool and detached script. For several reasons. One, the kind of personality that would tell you to go stuff it when you say, would you be willing to have a conversation with me, is a very difficult personality. And if you engage them in a, I want to understand your feelings about it, they are masters at manipulation. The kind of person that says something like that is the kind of person that will manipulate you. It's the kind of person that is very skilled at having very difficult conversations, usually more skilled than the leader is or the colleague is. So we have to limit ourselves to a very clear script. We have to keep ourselves in a very matter-of-fact. And, frankly, the kind of person that thinks they can get away with telling you no. If your boss came to you and said, hey, would you be willing to have a conversation with me about this? And you said no, well, odds are the boss is going to fire you. They were asking you, do you want to have this conversation, to be nice. But it really wasn't a question. Think about what kind of personality it takes to actually say no to a question like that. It takes a pretty aggressive, we call them talented terrors sometimes. It takes a pretty aggressive, difficult kind of personality to think you can get away with having that conversation. So we want to make sure that we don't go into this conversation with lots of fuzziness. We want to make sure we are crisp, clean, matter of fact. Is it cool? Yes. Is it unemotional? Yes. We're not getting angry. It's not aggressive, but it is assertive and it is detached, and it does say, I'm not having a discussion about the history. I'm not getting into a blow for blow. I am, however, telling you that this kind of conversation will not take place again. And by you establishing boundaries and establishing yourself as somebody who will not stand for these things, you downplay and you reduce the likelihood that you are going to see this kind of behavior again in the future. Now, as one final point for today, you can do all of these scripts beautifully. You can do them perfectly, and there's still a chance that you will see less than perfect reactions to the feedback. There's still a chance that people will respond with denial. I didn't do anything wrong at all. They'll respond with blame. Well, I don't know who you think you're talking to, but, you know, Bob's the one who's really messed this up. Go talk to Bob. They'll respond with excuses. Well, I would have gotten it done, but, you know, the server crashed last night, and so I just couldn't get it done. Or they'll respond with anxiety. Well, I know I made a mistake, and I'm totally freaking out about it because now I'm sure you're going to fire me because I didn't want to make the mistake, but I totally did. Now my career's over. It's entirely possible that you're going to see one of these 4 reactions. You may see the accountability. If you do it right, most of the time you'll see accountability, which is, you're right, I own it, let's figure out how to move forward and fix it. But sometimes you will see denial, blame, excuses, or anxiety. So what do you do when you see that? When you see denial, there's no problem, I didn't do anything wrong. Then what you're going to do is just like we did in the little example with the grammar and pulling out the strunk and white, and let's look at how you work a contraction and whether that works versus a possessive third-person pronoun, blah, blah, blah. Okay, what are we going to do with this? Well, when we see somebody who's in denial, all you have to remember is that denial is an emotional defense mechanism. It's an emotion. And so you want to be as unemotional as is humanly possible. You want to be calm, cool, collected. You're going to be factual. You're going to keep things in a very straightforward, matter of fact, no fuss, no muss kind of way, but we're going to keep this very, very simple. So when you see that, no, I'm not going to yell at you. I'm not going to fight with you. We're just going to pull out the strunk and white, our little guide to grammar, and we're going to go actually assess. Is this good? Is this not good? When you see people who start to blame others, well, yeah, I get that that's a problem, but it's not my problem. It's, you know, it's Bob's problem. Go talk to Bob. That's a key sign that we're just going to need to refocus this conversation. We're going to say to them, listen, fine, Bob is an issue, whatever. I don't really want to talk about Bob. What I want to talk about is what you and I can control right here, right now. I don't need to talk about Bob or anybody else. Let's just talk about you and me and what we can control right here, right now. When somebody starts making excuses, well, I couldn't get it done, you know, because the server crashed last night, and that's the reason why, and it doesn't matter. I'm not blaming you or anybody else. I don't want to fix the blame. All I want to fix is the problem. So let's set that aside. The server crashed, fine. It doesn't really matter. Let's just talk about what we need to do in the here and now to figure out how we can fix this issue moving forward. So when people feel like when they're getting blamed, that's when they start making excuses. So our job is simply to make sure that they don't feel like they're being blamed. And then finally, when people have anxiety, when you start to see people freaking out a bit about this, then our job is very simply to make sure that we break things into small enough chunks. So if we're starting to look at, we're having a constructive feedback conversation with somebody, and they start to feel like, I'm freaking out, you know, I understand, I'm wrong here, I'm at fault, but, you know, there's nothing I can do about it, then what we need to do in that case is simply break our stuff into bite-sized pieces so that, listen, if this is freaking you out too much, okay, let's just take one piece. You had 2 typos in the memo. Well, let's just start with that. Let's not talk about all of your writing. Let's not talk about your role as the VP of marketing. No, let's just talk about the typos in the memo. What's a simple thing we could do? Oh, well, we skipped using the proofreader. Okay, great. If you skipped using the proofreader this time, well, let's just, I don't know, let's use the proofreader. How about we just start there? What can we do to make sure that every single time you write a memo, you send it to proofreading? Very simple. We're just going to break this into bite-sized chunks. And after that, every so often, you may find that you messed up a little bit. And listen, every one of us has given some feedback from time to time where we didn't exactly follow the ideal script. We didn't exactly reframe this. We didn't exactly keep this fact-based. And we got a little snippy and chippy and everything else. When we do that, just use this approach and just apologize. Just say, listen, I'm sorry. I messed up because I know I sounded like I was attacking you. I chose some bad words, and that's not what I intended. Can I try this again? If you do that, you're just going to undo the badness and have a wonderful opportunity to actually recreate the conversation. One little psychological tip here is you'll notice that what you're apologizing for is choosing some bad words. You're not apologizing for being a jerk. Listen, I'm sorry. I was really trying to hurt you. You hurt me, and I really wanted to get back at you and cause you emotional pain. I shouldn't have done that. Can I try again? That doesn't work. See, people tend to excuse incompetence. What they do not tend to excuse is intent. So if you have evil intent and it didn't work out the way you'd hoped, they're going to be much less forgiving. If you just were incompetent, that is, you picked a wrong word. Listen, I just stumbled over a word. It happens. We're all going to say something stupid from time to time. I'm going to mangle a word in the number of webinars I do. It's going to happen. And so if you apologize for incompetence, you're in good shape. If you apologize for, listen, I really wanted to cause you pain, and yeah, I guess I did, that's not going to end as well for you as the alternative. So to recap all of this, remember, first and foremost, keep your communication as fact-based as possible. Limit the interpretations, reactions, and ends as much as possible. The ideal script is going to help you take those facts and deliver them in a really, really disarming way. And then once you do all that, when you see those negative reactions, the denial, blame, excuses, anxiety, just use these quick little turnarounds, these redirects is the technical term for them, and just make sure that people stay focused on the essence. You want to keep the emotions down, you want to keep the animus down, and you want to just have a simple conversation talking about facts. And if you do that, it's amazing how much truth you're going to be able to speak. Now with that wraps up the formal part of this program today. So now I'd like to turn it back over to John Reed, and let's see if we have some questions coming in. And fellows, I'll let you take it back over.
Well, Mark, this is Brad. Thank you so much
Brad,
for this absolutely wonderful presentation. We've had a few questions come in, but more so we've had some wonderful comments suggesting how helpful the presentation was. So thank you again. Why don't we jump into the first question, and I thought it was a good one. Someone had asked for more ways to address feedback with difficult personalities who may not be your direct report. Maybe it's someone that's working on a project for you from another department, and specifically that person might be less interested in addressing concerns or may have no direct repercussions for noncompliance. How would you address that?
Yeah, this is always a tricky issue, and a lot of it is it depends. So, which is a terrible way to answer a question. But number one issue is that there are people that when somebody makes the choice to not deliver good service to you, for example, whether they're a customer, whether you're in a different department, whatever, they're making a choice, and they're making a choice that says, I don't think you're worth it. I don't think you're that important. I don't think I need to listen to you. Or I think you're a jerk and I don't like you, and so I don't want to do this. But whatever the rationale is, they're making a choice to deliver something subpar to you versus everybody else. Now, once we kind of understand that they've made a choice to deliver us something not as good, the next question becomes, why? Well, if they think that we're a pushover, then we have to approach this with a very assertive boundary-setting approach. Now, perhaps perhaps it's a different situation though. Perhaps the reason that we haven't been getting good service from this person is that they've made their own interpretations about us. Now, lots of different ways to handle this. If you look at it, and this is one of the things that sometimes, I'm not saying it is at all in this case, but I know just my own life that sometimes we've said something that is maybe come across the wrong way, or this person interpreted something we said in a negative way, and now they're operating under a perspective that we're not the good person, we're not the nice person, in which case what we may have to do is do a little schmoozing, do a little relationship building. And if the person is consciously delivering poor service to us because they don't think we're worth it, because they think they're above us, because they have some issue with us, then we may have to just clearly establish some boundaries, like with the COM script, and say, no, just flat out not acceptable. Because usually when a person does that, they're making a calculation that they can get away with this. And usually it's kind of a bullying sort of behavior. So we basically got to establish boundaries that say I'm not going to be bullied. But if we look at our relationship and we think, maybe it was me, maybe I wasn't super nice to them at the beginning, then these are those cases where sometimes, a plate of cookies and a little friendliness can actually go a long way. I'd say more often than not, it's the former case. It's the case where they're making a little power play on us. But there are times where the little, the just being super nice, super friendly, a little extra cookies, where if that works and it fails, you can always go back to the COM script.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Another question came in on addressing feedback to remote employees. Is there anything that you need to do differently?
The one thing you really have to do differently is if you were going to make this a 10-minute conversation with 7 minutes of warm fuzzies, I would make it a 15-minute conversation with 10 minutes of warm fuzzies. What that basically means is it's harder to control the reactions in a remote conversation. So when you have a remote employee, you're typically not going to get to see the look on their face. It's typically you're going to be doing this over the phone. You never, ever want to do this via email. So you're going to be typically doing this over the phone. And you just don't have as much opportunity to control the reaction. Like if you mess up and you say something that's a little bit tough, and you can't see the expression on their face that signals to you just said something bad, you don't know that would have been a good time to apologize. So you're kind of operating a little bit blindly. So what you want to do is really make sure that you keep this dialogical. It's very hard to yell at somebody over the phone, and even having a constructive dialogue, because you are lacking that extra sense that tells you I'm getting into dangerous territory. You really just want to make sure that you have, this is really a conversation. So when you're having that conversation, hey, do you have a few minutes to talk? When would be a good time for us to talk? Okay, I just kind of want to review that situation. You may even begin with something like a constructive dialogue and take it from there. So tell me about how that project went. How do you think it went? What went really well for you? What didn't go so well? What would you do differently if you could go back and do it all over again? Oh, okay, great, wonderful. Well, listen, there is one thing that I'd like to point out, something you didn't raise. Would you be willing to take a few minutes to have this conversation with me? Okay, awesome. I just want to review it, make sure I'm on the same page, blah, 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 blah. I caught a couple of typos, actually, in the report that was submitted. Do you know which ones I'm talking about? So now you can actually kind of double up the constructive dialogue script with the ideal script. Start with a constructive dialogue because it's softer. It presumes a certain emotional intelligence, but then move into the ideal script. And basically, if they haven't kind of stumbled upon the feedback that you needed to give, now you can give it. But it softens it just enough that it makes it a little easier to control over the phone as opposed to face-to-face.
Okay, terrific. And I think we only have time for one more question, so I'm going to kind of combine questions here. How would you address feedback that has been given to someone who kind of just shows a general lack of respect for authority and already has been given the same feedback 1 or 2 times in the past?
Generally speaking, this is a sign that you've got somebody who is making a choice to not receive the feedback. And this means minimally you're in the territory of the calm script, but it also means that you've typically got a talented terror. And talented terrors, if they don't get the message, it means that they basically don't think you're actually going to follow through on any consequences, which tells you right there basically what your next step is. You have to enforce some consequences. Think of it this way. If the chairman of the board walked past this person's office, let's say this person's name is Bob, and Bob's a jerk, and Bob has been given feedback multiple times. Ask yourself this question: if the chairman of the board walked past, how's Bob going to react? Is Bob going to be apathetic and lazy and dismissive? Or is Bob going to say, oh, good morning, sir. It's wonderful to see you. I will get right on that report. Absolutely. Yes, sir. If they're the kind of person that would turn a different face to the chairman of the board and say, I will get right on that, sir, then you know they've got a talented terror, and the only reason they're not responding to you is they don't believe you are actually going to follow through on the consequences, which basically tells you you have to, A, follow through on the consequences, and this person, it's entirely possible that if you've had this conversation multiple times, it's possible that now we're hitting a point where they may not be entirely salvageable.
Terrific. Thank you so much. We've reached our time limit here, but I did want to invite John Reed McDonald back onto the call just to give us some closing remarks, and thank you so much, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. And Mark, thank you as always. At PrideStaff, we're a big fan of every webinar and every time we hear you speak, and it's not surprising that this was no different. So thank you for the insight. Thank you for helping us and also a number of employers across the U.S. Tackle this tough issue. So to the rest of the attendees on the phone, thank you for your time and thank you for joining us. We attempt to have several of these learning events throughout the year for you, so please keep your eye out for more information from PrideStaff in the next 90 to 120 days on our next event. So Mark, thank you again, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.